right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be here with this panel of discussants because 75 years ago, NATO was founded with 12 countries. As we know, it's since grown by more than 20 members. That's a remarkable achievement and one that we've been celebrating this week. But its strength comes not only from within, but also from its partners around the world. And NATO today maintains relations with 40 partners working on key issues like terrorism and climate change and a number of other challenges across the national security front. So we have with us representatives from those and thought leaders as well. So to talk about NATO's partnerships, what they do and where they go from here. So to my immediate right is the Deputy Secretary of State, Kurt Campbell. We have Mihai Popsoi, the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Moldova. Simon Draper, Ambassador for New Zealand to the European Union and NATO. And Mirna Galic, Senior Policy Analyst for China and East Asia at the U.S. Institute of Peace. So thank you all for joining us. Deputy Secretary Campbell, maybe I can start with you. And there has been a lot of focus this week on, for very obvious reasons, on Europe, on Russia and Ukraine, on NATO and the allies and the cohesion and what they've been able to accomplish. But how do you think about the role of partners today and where those partnerships may be going in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East, and elsewhere?
Well, first, Richard, it's wonderful to be here and welcome to everyone here. It's a pretty incredible gathering, actually, and we've been planning it, frankly, for years, but to see it to come to fruition with all its moving pieces is actually deeply gratifying. And I think, Richard, you're right to point out the many moving pieces and the elements of what we believe has been an historic and successful summit. The work on Ukraine, the common challenges that we're facing across Europe. But I think what's important also is that this is the third gathering of what we now call the IP4, or the Indo-Pacific Partners. This is Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and they are gathering here in NATO, the 75th anniversary, to continue a process which basically speaks to the continuing connectivity between the Indo-Pacific and Europe. Now, I think historically, we had thought of these two theaters as, frankly, deeply separate. And somehow, if you worked on one, it came at the expense of the other. I think what we're finding increasingly is that common security challenges are in play across both theaters. And one of the things that we've been enormously benefited by in these gatherings, both today, but frankly over the last several days, is the perspectives from Indo-Pacific partners as we considered common challenges. So I think one of the points that has become quite clear here over the last couple of days is that there is a growing appreciation and anxiety about the role of China supporting Russia's defense industrial base and its war machine in Ukraine, and North Korea's provision of ammunition and weaponry to Russia as it continues its fight in Ukraine. I will say that one of the things that's been unique about the Ukraine crisis, not only have you seen the United States and Europe rise to meet the challenge, but really for the first time in our experience, Indo-Pacific partners like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and other countries as well, have supported the effort, both in terms of humanitarian support, energy, but also military support as well. And I'll just finish, if I could, conclude on this note. As you all know, it took some time to pass the supplemental that ultimately brought relief and support, much of which has been rolled out this week, for Ukraine in its desperate fight, and particularly with respect to air defenses. It was stuck in one of our chambers of Congress during the state visit of Prime Minister Kishida to the United States earlier this year. He gave us a speech to the joint session of Congress and spoke very eloquently. His first topic of substance was an appeal to Congress to support Ukraine, making the argument that, in fact, the security was indivisible, and that if Ukraine was somehow defeated or dispatched, that it would have terrible consequences in the Indo-Pacific. Many congresspeople, Richard, that were on the fence were deeply moved by that. And in the days followed, that piece of legislation passed. And so I think we are here today to really not only sort of celebrate this growing alliance between democracies and to welcome the role of the Indo-Pacific leaders and nations in this historic gathering, but also to inaugurate a number of flagship projects, which both NATO and the countries of the IP4 will work on together, and that's in cybersecurity, battling disinformation, areas where we face common challenges. And so this is an exciting element of what's taking place. It probably doesn't get the same splash of what's playing out in the battlefields of Ukraine, but at the same time, over the medium and long term, this is a deeply significant development.
Deputy Prime Minister, when the Deputy Secretary General was on the stage earlier today, he said that Moldova faces a very severe set of hybrid risks from Russia. It's a difficult neighborhood. How do you think about the partnership of your country with NATO? What are you doing with NATO? And as you look to the next sort of horizon here, what would you like to do with the alliance?
Well, thank you first and foremost for this opportunity. Indeed, the Republic of Moldova is the country most affected by the Russian aggression against Ukraine other than Ukraine itself. Moldova has welcomed about 1.5 million of Ukrainian refugees in a country of about 2.5 million, still welcoming about 115,000, which is about 4% of Moldova's population. And Moldova and Moldovans understand full well that Ukraine is defending us as much as they're defending themselves. And we remain committed to helping our Ukrainian friends and neighbors in this moment of need. And we'll continue to provide Ukrainian refugees access to healthcare, labor market, education, everything we can possibly provide. When it comes to building our own resilience, indeed, our capacities are modest, but we are encouraged by the support that we receive from the international community, from the United States, from our partners in the European Union. We just signed recently with the EU an agreement in the defense and security sector, a partnership. We have very strong ties in security and defense cooperation with the United States. And with NATO, we have 30 years of partnership for peace, cooperation that has allowed Moldovan institutions to build resilience, to allow us to be better positioned to withstand this avalanche of Russian hybrid tactics against the Republic of Moldova. One of the main avenues that the Russians are exploiting are our security vulnerabilities when it comes to cyber defenses, and we are working constantly with our partners in the EU, in the United States, to build those capabilities. And NATO has been instrumental throughout these years helping Moldova's security and defense sector grow, and this dialogue and this cooperation continues. And the Republic of Moldova is firmly committed to being not just a security consumer, given our challenges with the Russian-backed separatist region in the Transnistrian region in the Republic of Moldova. But Moldova is also actively pursuing its role as security provider. For the past 10 years now, Moldova has been actively participating with its servicemen and women in the KFOR mission in Kosovo, in UNIFIL in Lebanon, in Somalia, in Bosnia, and we look forward to continuously growing our presence through various avenues in order to truly contribute to the international community. And our challenges remain severe, but thanks to the support of our friends and partners in the international community, and thanks to the commitment of our citizens, we are now stronger and more resilient than we were 2-3 years ago. The biggest achievement is in energy security. 3 years ago, it felt impossible to cut that umbilical cord that we were tied with Gazprom for 30 years. Now, the Republic of Moldova is no longer dependent on Gazprom for gas. We are buying it on the international market. And oddly enough, sometimes it's cheaper to buy American LNG than it is to buy gas from Russia based on the contract that they've imposed on us. And, needless to say that the Russian gas contracts come with significant political strings attached. And we've suffered more than our fair share of this political blackmail when it comes to gas, but also to access to the Russian market when it comes to our agricultural produce. Now we have diversified. We are firmly anchoring ourselves in Europe. And thanks to the support of our friends in the European Union, we are a candidate country now as of June 25th. This is an important step for the Republic of Moldova, and we look forward to exploring all these opportunities and capitalizing on these opportunities, because God knows the people of Moldova have waited far too long for this opportunity to return to the European family of nations, for which we've been ripped apart for no fault of our own in the Second World War. And thanks to the support of our friends in Europe, and thanks to the support of our friends in Europe and across the Atlantic, Moldova and Moldovans will continue to build their resilience, continue to be a trusted partner in the region, and continue to deliver peace and security and prosperity to our people.
Great, thank you. Ambassador, it is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and so how do you think about NATO's role in the Indo-Pacific and New Zealand's role in NATO? New Zealand has been involved in out-of-area operations that NATO has done in places like Afghanistan and things like that. When you look now at the fact that in the NATO strategic concept, there's a lot of language about China and about the Indo-Pacific, their Indo-Pacific partners like New Zealand. What do you think is the future of the role of NATO in the region and New Zealand's role in the alliance?
Thanks, Richard, and let me add my thanks for the invitation today. As you mentioned, New Zealand's been a partner of NATO for over 27 years. We were in Kosovo and we've been in Afghanistan, and that's for two reasons primarily. One, and it sounds a bit apple pie, but it comes down to NATO is about protecting liberal democracies, and New Zealanders have invested a lot of blood and treasure trying to advance liberal democracies, and protecting those. So we do it for a values reason. We do it for a practical reason. Interoperability with NATO means our small armed forces can be part of something bigger. But as Kurt mentioned quite rightly, the evolution has been that in 2024, security challenges we face don't respect borders. So what happens in the Euro-Atlantic affects what happens in the Indo-Pacific, and vice versa. So what we've seen with the IP4 partners and their engagement with NATO is, NATO is the largest, preeminent, longest standing defence alliance. You guys know a whole lot of stuff that we simply don't in New Zealand. By the same token, our geography, when we look up and we see the Pacific and Asia, we have a different perspective. So we want to learn as much from NATO's experience and how we can get better at our own security. And I hope it's vice versa, that it's not a one-way thing, that we have some perspectives and insights that is valuable to NATO. So I think the way that we're seeing it is that there's much more in common to join us in terms of sharing experience and learning from each other. And clearly, the mood and the knack just before was around we just need to do more and more together and learn from each other as much as we can. And frankly, would be foolish not to.
Great. Mirna, you've written about NATO and its Indo-Pacific partnerships in particular, and about the role that they might play in dealing with the China challenge overall. As we were just talking about, if you go back just a couple of years, NATO seems to really have been sensitized to the nature of the China challenge, despite the fact that it is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What role do you think those partnerships in the Indo-Pacific can play concretely in helping to deal with the China challenge that faces all of the NATO countries?
Well, I think one really important thing is to take a look at what we've already done with NATO and these partnerships over time. Because I think critically over the past couple of years, these 4 partners have really become more institutionalized into NATO's structures and functions. And that allows them to be able to have a seat at the table at important occasions, and also when partners are sharing information. And they're able to provide a lot of insight from personal experience and from being very geographically close to China about what's happening in the region, what's happening with security, not only with China, but also with North Korea, but also just sort of providing that perspective from the region of why Europe needs to continue to focus its eyes there. And I think that's a really key element that these partners provide to NATO. They also have expertise on China that frankly has been lacking in NATO because NATO hasn't been focused on the region for that long. So I think that's certainly one element that they can provide very well.
Could I say one word on that, Richard? I really like that point. But the truth is what we're seeing is a growth of multifaceted institutions across the Indo-Pacific. The Quad, the trilateral between the United States, Japan, and South Korea, the United States, Japan, and the Philippines, a variety of other initiatives like AUKUS. What's, I think, important about this, and I completely agree, that there is a degree of, some people get a little anxious with the term institutionalization. But I think that is happening, maybe regularization, but it's critically important. Frankly, Japan and Australia are deeply engaged in a lot of these dialogues, but it is important. South Korea needs to be more represented given its global heft. And to be honest, Richard, we very much welcome New Zealand. The new New Zealand Prime Minister is here. He has done a remarkable job, and we very much appreciate the signs that New Zealand understands some of the challenges that we're facing in the Pacific. I've spoken out clearly about wanting to work in Five Eyes and other institutions. And so I think this is another sort of piece of the lattice work that I think we are together building across the Indo-Pacific, but also that increasingly links us with friends and partners in Europe, India, and elsewhere.
Kurt, let me just follow up with you on one thing. So another thing that one hears sometimes is worries about NATO taking on a geographic agenda that is beyond its mandate, or that there should be some sort of geographic division of labor where European military power is most acute and effective if concentrated in its neighborhood, could get diluted if spread around the Indo-Pacific. So why don't the Europeans sort of focus on their continent, the Americans and their treaty allies in Asia focus on the Indo-Pacific? How do you think about Europe in Asia and the Indo-Pacific partners in Europe?
So, Richard, the first I would say is that I think that definition relies on a rather narrow, actually geographically based set of challenges and experiences. I think if you look at our flagship initiatives, they are around issues and challenges that are global in nature, that are frankly affect all of us in deeply serious ways. If you note, New Zealand just a few months ago, for the first time, really acknowledged a serious cyber attack against its infrastructure and identified concerns about the culprit. What we are seeking to take on with respect to these flagships initiatives are issues that really are not defined by geography, that they inhabit cyberspace. They are about some of the issues that the foreign minister indicated, serious problems associated with very negative tracks and propaganda that is affecting all of us. And so these experiences in building resilience are increasingly global. And so for those people who say, look, we can't take on an out-of-area mission, look, I think we all understand some of the hesitations, and the truth is there are a lot of countries in the Indo-Pacific that need to be talked to carefully and explained about what, in fact, NATO is about, and that we're not seeking for an out-of-area conventional military set of steps. At the same time, there's a lot of work that needs to be done together. And frankly, I'll tell you the thing that I was most excited about at the Mellon Auditorium, when all the leaders came in, some of the warmest welcomes not only to friends like Ukraine, others that were there, were to the Indo-Pacific partners. It was a real sense of you are most welcome among us. And I think it was felt and acknowledged, and we want to continue it.
Ambassador, let me just go to you on this for a second. Is that sort of how you think about New Zealand's role in the alliance, in the sense that, is this a feature that's here to stay? What, you know, the IP4 participating, you know, at senior levels in NATO summits, that this sort of ratchets forward in terms of operationalizing what might actually be possible? Or is there skepticism about, you know, what New Zealand should be doing off with NATO when it's got its own issues to deal with closer to home?
No, I don't. To answer your question, you know, the last bit first, no, I don't think New Zealanders, and certainly the New Zealand government, don't. You know, you just have to look at the connection that's happened now between Pyongyang and Putin to see that, you know, this Ukraine thing's now, you know, that's the existential threat for our part of the world as a regime like DPRK with nukes. So, you know, we understand that very, very clearly. In terms of the IP4, we met as a group while NATO were meeting earlier today. We met with President Zelensky and had the opportunity to meet with President Biden. And it seems to us that there is a commonality between us as a group that, you know, it's sort of like an unintended outcome in a way, but it's a very positive one for us, where we are looking at seeing where we can meet on the margins of other events. And certainly our Prime Minister was keen to talk about that with his Japanese and Australian and Korean colleagues, and they were very supportive. And so, yeah, I think you will see the IP4 in various, you know, iterations around, but it started with an invitation from Secretary Stoltenberg, and you know, attendance at further NATO will be whether NATO members invite us, but if we are invited, I'm very sure we'd come.
And Deputy Prime Minister, let me go to you. So I was in Moldova earlier this year. If you haven't been to Moldova, I encourage everyone to visit. It's a pretty remarkable country. You're also in a very remarkable place. And one thing that was absolutely clear was, for Moldova, a huge amount turns on what happens in Ukraine, and therefore NATO's continued support for Ukraine and its resistance against Russia's war of aggression. I mean, that's as plain as day when you get there. So one question is, what are the lessons that you think NATO is drawing, rightly or wrongly, from its experience supporting Ukraine? And then the other is, you know, as a partner of NATO, if you had sort of a wish list of next things that you would like to see take place in your own partnership with the alliance, what would that look like?
Well, first and foremost, I could not agree more when it comes to the invitation to visit Moldova. That's a given. When it comes to NATO, Republic of Moldova, and Ukraine, well, of course, we want to see a lot more support for Ukraine, because support for Ukraine is also support for Moldova. And we are encouraged by what we heard the other day at the Mellon Auditorium with President Biden having this forceful message of reassuring Ukraine and providing support that is needed every single day. And we couldn't have had a more horrendous scene setter for this event here in Washington the day before it began, with the barbaric Russian attack on the Children's Hospital. And for Moldovans, that is too close to home, because many Moldovan children before the war used to be treated at that hospital for cancer. So we have been used to some degree to the normalization of war in the past 2.5 years, but that was a bridge too far, even for the murderous regime in the Kremlin. It is. I have no words to share the horror that Kyiv residents and the whole of Ukraine is going through every single day. And NATO, of course, NATO members can and should do more, just like Ukraine is committed and every single day is proving with sacrifice and with courage on the front line that they are determined to protect their country, even though some discarded Ukraine. They were giving Ukrainians only 3 to 5 days. Well, we are the third year into the war, and Ukraine is still standing strong. And as I said, we are encouraged by the decision of our friends and partners to continuously provide support, F-16s, long-range missiles. That is something that allows Ukraine to protect itself and protect, quite frankly, the whole eastern flank of NATO. When it comes to the Republic of Moldova, we've had a strong partnership with the alliance in the past 30 years. And I must say, for me, it's a bit personal. NATO was my first job. I worked for the NATO center in Moldova, and I see there in the back of the room a friend of mine with whom we worked together 15 years ago. One of the most memorable projects that NATO did in Moldova, apart from building resilience in defense and security sector, helping Moldova's Academy of Sciences with technical assistance, but one that is closest to my heart is a humanitarian project that NATO did in Moldova. We had pesticides scattered around the country, tons and tons of them, following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And unfortunately, we didn't have the resources to do away with those pesticides, and they were poisoning the soil and then underground water. And it was NATO taxpayer money that funded a project that disposed all of those pesticides. And I wish more Moldovan citizens were aware, and we as a government are trying to break through this wall of propaganda that the Kremlin has built in the minds of many Moldovans, creating this boogeyman image out of NATO. But many are not aware of this, of the numerous humanitarian projects that we've benefited from, not to mention the building capacity in our army and the broader defense sector. So there is certainly room for improvement, but we are encouraged by the strong position that NATO members have taken when it comes to Ukraine. And of course, we are counting that this support will remain as steadfast as we've seen it. And we count that that will be a game changer, the support that is coming now, because developments on the front line in Ukraine are also directly affecting the political situation and the political stability in the Republic of Moldova. And we've seen Russian proxies becoming more brazen lately. But we are confident that with this strong support for the long haul that the Euro-Atlantic community is showing for Ukraine, Ukraine will ultimately prevail, and peace and stability will return to our region. And we will no longer be in the situation of counting victims that have absolutely nothing to do with the war, including children that are suffering every single day. So we hope, and they say that hope is not a great strategy. Unfortunately, Moldova is more often than not is the only thing we have. And we count on our friends and partners in the Euro-Atlantic community to continuously standing there by Ukraine.
Can I just say one thing, Richard? I know, there's a lot of soaring stuff. This week also has its challenges. I will say, you go through a variety of meetings. I had the opportunity to meet the foreign minister. One of the most inspiring presentations, a true patriot, tremendously focused on reform and engaging with us. And so I must say I'm very pleased to hear you guys clapping for a wonderful representative who's striving to integrate this country into what we're all doing. So let's do one more, okay? And then.
Mirna, let me go to you. In just a moment, we have a little time for questions, so we'll take some questions from the audience. What's possible next? So, especially in the Indo-Pacific. So if you look at the partnerships that exist, we've had participation in the summits, information exchanges, work on cybersecurity, other things here and there. What's the next set of tasks, of areas of collaboration between the allies and Indo-Pacific partners that would really make a difference, particularly given the China challenge in the region?
So first, I want to just go back again to this idea of, I think a lot of the heavy lifting on these partnerships has already been done well. The building of the partnerships in terms of getting to know one another and providing various kinds of cooperation already in terms of, as Campbell noted, the regularization of these partners into NATO processes, and in terms of really making it clear why these partners are important. So I think these partnerships are well on their way. Each of the 4 partners now, I believe including New Zealand, have signed their new individually tailored partnership programs. As a group, they've decided on some things that they want to work on together with NATO, including cyber and information, disinformation, and things like this. And so, I think the real key now is to focus on consolidation, to focus on implementing and actionalizing those plans and the things that have already been done. Now, that said, I think there are some other areas that we could always continue to push on, and I think one of them certainly is in regards to China and disinformation. And I think really having, both from the NATO side and also from the partner side, to the extent that they feel comfortable, a more strategic pushback on the messaging that China does about NATO in the region, which is not accurate and is reflecting a lot of China, or a lot of Russia's also messaging on NATO. And I think there needs to be a stronger pushback from NATO about what NATO is and isn't doing in the region, about what NATO does and doesn't want in the region, and about what these partners feel about NATO in the region. So, or NATO rather on the region, because NATO is not physically in the region. So that is an area that I think is really important. And also another thing that I would add, and I think the ambassador already alluded to this, I think the 4 can really focus on what do they want to get out of being a foursome? Is there something to be strategically gained as a foursome that they're not already taking advantage of, both at NATO or in the region, and how to develop that further? I think they've now had their 3rd quadripartite meeting on the sidelines of the NATO summit, and I know that a lot is going on there. So continuing to develop that sort of platform for themselves to the extent that they feel comfortable, I think is also useful.
Great. We have a question, an online question. This is from Ira Strauss. This goes to Dr. Campbell. Should the IP4 be given a standing invitation to all future NATO summits so it becomes a more organic, cumulative relationship?
I would fully 100% support that. And, I think we've heard gracious, from both the New Zealand and Moldova that, they'd appreciate an invite. I think we need to regularize. I do believe a degree of planning is helpful. And so I think it's an excellent idea.
Great. Question right here.
Yes, hi, thank you. Jackson Richmond with the Epoch Times. This is for the Moldovan foreign minister. So Moldova looks to join NATO. At the same time, Moldova is looking to join the EU. What's the latest on that? Which should we expect to see first, Moldova in NATO or Moldova in the EU? Thank you.
Well, first, let's remind ourselves of the Bucharest summit of 2008, when Georgia and Ukraine really wanted to join, and unfortunately didn't, and not because they didn't want to. The Republic of Moldova will most likely join the European Union first, but we count on Ukraine's progress when it comes to NATO. Unfortunately, in the Republic of Moldova, the post-Soviet inertia, but also the Russian propaganda in the past 30 years have inoculated this idea to many citizens that neutrality is a guarantee of security. And it may be for Switzerland, but in our neck of the woods, it's a questionable proposition. But unfortunately for many citizens, Russian propaganda has effectively in the past 30 years drilled that notion into many citizens. And let's be honest, it's a soothing idea for many citizens. You are neutral, you don't have to spend on defense, nobody's going to attack you, right? Nobody ever in history attacked a neutral country, right? Unfortunately, for many citizens, that message doesn't resonate enough. And it's up to the political leadership to talk to their citizens, and that is what we're trying to do, to have an open, public discussion about security vulnerabilities and about opportunities of addressing those vulnerabilities. And if you ask me personally, it doesn't take a PhD in security studies to know that NATO is the ultimate guarantee of security, not just in our region, but anywhere else in the world. But given our particular circumstances, it'll take some time until we are able, within a democratic process, to convince enough of our citizens that NATO is the real solution. In the meantime, we are firmly committed to our European integration path, and there is a security cooperation component there as well. And we're encouraged by the current discussions in Brussels of boosting the security cooperation in Europe, and you would believe that it's high time for that to happen. And we want to be part of those discussions, of the logistics lines that are being built now. So European Union accession is a priority, but our cooperation with NATO is very important. And I totally agree that it is good to have everybody at the same table, because as they say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and we don't want to be on the menu.
Ambassador, maybe I could ask you, New Zealand, a partner of NATO, has been full-throated in its support for Ukraine, a partner of NATO. What are the stakes for New Zealand in Ukraine? And why doesn't it make sense, as you hear from time to time, that, U.S. assistance to Ukraine is zero-sum with what we might be doing in the Indo-Pacific, in your neighborhood, and so amounts to something of a distraction? Or you hear these sort of narratives, you heard some of them here during the debate, the long debate over U.S. assistance to Ukraine. So why does Ukraine matter for the Indo-Pacific and for New Zealand in particular?
So the answer to that is quite simple in a way. Big countries don't invade small countries. If that becomes the rule of power, then we're all in for a terrible future. If we can let a country walk into another, then it's not going to stop at the Ukraine. You're just dreaming if you think that that's the lesson authoritarian powers take from that. So it's a we've talked about it, our Prime Minister's talked about it in a way, we don't have a Russian diaspora, we don't have a Ukrainian diaspora. You're right, we're a long way away, but it's in our DNA. You can't let these things stand. You have to do the right thing. So that's why at a time when our government budgets are tight, we have increased our funding to the Ukraine. And so, to go to your question, we do it because it's the right thing to do. We do it also because we know that if you let this sort of thuggery continue, it's not going to stop in the Ukraine, and it will come knocking at your door at some stage. And we want to stand resolutely with Ukraine and our NATO friends to stop that happening. And we're small, we're a long way away, but we are making our contribution. And if everyone made their contribution, then Putin doesn't stand a chance.
Can I say just two things on that? I really appreciate the comments there, but Ambassador, I have followed and worked on New Zealand for a long time, and I have been struck. There had been a sense that New Zealand is a long way away and maybe unaffected by these things, but I will say developments in the Pacific suggest that, even New Zealand, I think, increasingly appreciates that these challenges can find you out, even in a distant geography. I would also say, Richard, the truth is this idea of, big countries have certain, sort of rights to do certain things to smaller countries. If you read carefully, and I think too often we just kind of glance at these things, look at the manifesto issued by China and Russia in advance of the Beijing Olympics. It is a very thorough, transparent document which combines kind of 1950s kind of ideology and 1930s territorial ambitions. And it states quite clearly that, smaller countries better look out. That kind of approach is perilous and must be confronted and dealt with. And I very much appreciate folks on this panel, sort of the clarion call to a true understanding of the challenges that we're facing.
Mirna, let me go to you on a question. When you have partnerships with multiple countries, there's always this question of deepening versus widening, or however you might want to put it. Should the IP4 eventually be an IP more than 4 and bring in other countries and things like that? Or is the task before us to deepen the partnerships that exist, to make them more material, to make them more operationalized? Or do you try to do both of those at the same time? I mean, what's the way forward in terms of thinking about the specific set of partnerships in the Indo-Pacific for NATO?
Well, first I'll say I think that's definitively up to the allies and the potential partners themselves. But in my view, I think you can probably do those things at the same time. I think, as I've already said, I think consolidation of these existing partnerships is very important, because then you're actually getting the gains that you've been investing in for so long. In terms of other partners in the Indo-Pacific, I think it's a bit tricky, because not only does NATO have to be interested, but these countries themselves have to be interested. So I'm not sure what discussions have been happening at NATO between NATO folks and these countries in the region, but I'll leave that to the people in the alliance to determine forward.
Kurt, maybe we've got less than 2 minutes left, so maybe I'll make this the last question. We've been talking about why what happens in Europe matters in other regions, especially in the Indo-Pacific, why what happens with a partner like Ukraine will matter for other partners like New Zealand and Moldova and others. But what happens in the Indo-Pacific also matters for the NATO allies, right? And so I think this is most manifest as people see the provision of Chinese components and parts to enable the Russian war machine that would not be as robust if they weren't doing that. How should the European and the North American allies think about what happens in the Indo-Pacific and why that matters in the North Atlantic?
So, I've been involved in dialogues in Europe on the Indo-Pacific for decades. I think previously, Richard, most of those dialogues were really about commercial opportunities, largely in China. What has been remarkable is the dramatic increase in political, strategic, security dialogues with other countries. And I think there's a much deeper recognition, again, as we've been discussing throughout this panel, of the common challenges, but also opportunities that these countries face. If I can, to the last question, I think the key issue going forward is going to be, if you look at these sort of, kind of tapestry of minilaterals and other institutions, the key going forward will be, how does ASEAN and the nations of ASEAN feel about these gatherings? How do they want to associate with them? We've spent a lot of time in the Quad figuring out how to ensure that there is a degree of sort of intellectual interoperability. Some of the leading nations, I think, in Southeast Asia, if they had their way, they would be more active. But I think that's a chapter that's yet to be written, Richard.
All right, well, great. Oh, yes, Ambassador?
Yeah, just I see it says wrapping up, and I just wanted to take the opportunity, and this is not a hagiography, but I just want to acknowledge the work that Kurt Campbell has done in terms of the Indo-Pacific and making that connectivity between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo. He's been tirelessly doing it, and I certainly know from the New Zealand perspective, we're really appreciative of the time and effort that he has put in to what is a relatively small country. So I just wanted to publicly acknowledge that and say thank you, Kurt.
Thank you.
You're here. Thank you very much to the panel here, and thank you all for participating in this, and on to the next.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good.